Seven, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome back to the History with Jackson podcast. In today's episode, I'm talking to public historian Sarah Biegelsen all about her project, Showman's Land Entertainment for the US war effort in World War I. This was a really great episode. I really enjoyed talking to Sarah all about some of the entertainment figures in World War I, how they affected the US war effort, and looking at how they had different roles due to their gender and race. It's a really fascinating conversation. Now, in this episode, and I do mention it beforehand, and in this intro, I am suffering from a horrendous cold. So I do sound very gravelly. I do apologise for that. But Sarah sounds brilliant. So I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll leave you in the warm hands of Sarah. Hello and welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast. I hope you're all doing well. And today, guys, we are joined by public historian Sarah Biegelsen to talk all about her work, Showman's Land Entertainment for the US war effort in World War I. How are you doing, Sarah?
I'm very well. How are you, Jackson?
I'm doing very well. I'm really happy to finally get you on the podcast. So I'm looking forward to talking about World War I entertainment with you.
Yeah, me too. I'm excited.
So my first question, I ask this for all my guests here on the podcast: what inspired you to do this project and the podcast that came out from it?
Sure. So I'm from Kansas City, which is right in the middle of the United States. And I don't want to say Missouri or Kansas because my heart belongs to both of them. And in Kansas City is the National World War I Museum and Memorial. I don't want to go through the whole history of the memorial and how it became a museum, but it's been a museum since 2006. And that's when I started going to it. And I've always just loved how amazing of a job they do with their exhibits, with their collection. They have wonderful volunteers, the whole shebang. And because of that museum is why I became interested in World War I history. And I was always just flabbergasted why World War I history wasn't as well known as World War II history. And so since probably about the age of 13, I've been on a quest to answer that kind of question. Like, why is World War I not as well known? Or why has it been forgotten about, especially in the United States? In Europe, it's far more memorialized than it is in this country. I've also been a fan of early 20th century pop culture from the United States. And I was very pleased to come up with an idea combining those two passions for history. And when I was in undergrad, I did my thesis on World War I memorials in the United States. So I was able to answer a lot of those questions related to World War I memory on the monument level, but I wanted to answer the memory issue related to more identity and pop culture. And most people know what the United Service Organization is, the USO in America, and there are equivalent organizations during World War II in other countries as well. But entertainment for World War I just had not been really delved into. So that was kind of the spark, like, oh my God, I can combine the two things that I am really interested in into one thesis. And then it became a podcast. As I'm a public historian, I didn't want it to just live in a very dull, dry academic paper format because most people wouldn't read it. I don't blame them. I wouldn't read it. And so I thought, well, what is a format that is modern and accessible that I think people would be interested in? And podcast was the first thing I thought of. So I wanted to display the stories I tell on a format that showcased how popular these entertainers were back then on a popular medium today.
I really like the fact that it's something that developed out of your experiences when you were 13. You know,
Yeah.
I think that's really great because a lot of us we get into history on, one different subject, but we don't often come back to that subject. It's just our side interest. But for you to be
Yeah.
able to make it your main interest, that's brilliant to see that that's the culmination of so many years of interest, love, and passion come together as one piece. It's absolutely brilliant to hear.
Thank
And I
you.
certainly agree with you on the papers. Sometimes when you open some of those papers and you just look at the first page, you're like, oh God, this is.
Yeah, like bless anyone who puts in the time and effort to write do the research, do the outlining, and write those papers. Because I've written them myself, and they are hard to do, and they are seldom appreciated. But that is just the reality. No one
Yeah.
wants to read a dense academic work.
So I kind of want to turn our focus onto your project now. And in your project, you break it down into three different individuals. I'm sorry, I'm sounding so gravelly. I've got a cold. So your three individuals were Charlie Chaplain, Elsie Janis, and James Reese Europe. How did you make the decision to focus on these three then?
Yeah, so early on, I knew that I wanted to focus on figures from the film, theater, and music industries. And I knew that if I did the entire industries themselves, that would be like a few volumes of a book series. So I was like, let me narrow it down to three individual people. And so the reason why I chose those three is because they were probably a few of the most visible figures for the war effort for the US. They were very popular, like household names, essentially, depending on the audience. And I also was interested in an intersectional story of not just film, theater, and music, but larger social identities. So for Chaplin, he is an immigrant from England. Elsie Janis was a woman, and James Reese Europe was a black man. And I wanted to see how their social identities, alongside their entertainment industries, influence the war, influence them, and influence those industries.
It makes for a really interesting study and project, being able to compare the experience of an immigrant from perhaps the dominant identity within America at that point, and with two groups which were marginalized in both in different societies. It's really interesting to see the juxtaposition of those positions. Now, I want to touch firstly on Charlie Chaplin, and you made a great point there that he was English. Not a lot of people know that, but how does he become vital to the sale of Liberty loans, and what are Liberty loans? He's an immigrant selling something for two American citizens, really.
Right. So Liberty Loans was a way to finance the war effort through borrowing. It's all financial stuff that I can't explain that well beyond my expertise, but that's the basic concept. And the government, the US government, had implemented several Liberty Loan tours, essentially, or Liberty Loan fundraising efforts that were to finance the war. Um, and so when Chaplin came around for the third Liberty Loan, that tour, that's when this takes place. Uh, the government specifically sought him out, as well as a couple of other film stars at the time, specifically Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford. Those three, I can't even describe just how famous these three people were. Like, I try to make a comparison to like superhero actors today. It's even bigger than that, honestly, because there was nobody else on that level of fame, and like film celebrity was just coming about at this time. And so the government reached out to the three of them as a patriotic duty. And the three, like, there wasn't even, like, as far as I know, like any debate or any like compromise or anything. They were just like, yes, we will be doing that. So in April 1918, they went around the country, like each of them focused on a different region. Chaplain was focused mostly in the South. And they just combined their forces to raise as much money as possible. And everyone was just thrilled with this because these film stars had literally only been on screen for most audience members.
I think it's really interesting how they were able to, go on these tours, divide the country, but instantly say yes to the government as well, and particularly for Chaplin when he's not an American, he's an immigrant at that point. Yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic. So I kind of want to touch on that a little bit more. Then is, he's an Englishman, he's doing something, a patriotic duty for the Americans. How was he able to make this a patriotic exercise for himself?
Absolutely, yeah. So another reason why Chaplin and also Mary Pickford was from Canada, they were also just wanting to give back to the United States. Chaplin had lived in the U.S. Only since about 1910, give or take. And he started making films in early 1914. So he had been of an overnight like success story, like American dream. He is the definition of it because he had grown up in poverty and just achieved like worldwide stardom. And when he was starting his film career, not long after the war started in Europe, and because he was becoming so well known, he was a household name. Uh, like you can only be so popular when people start to criticize you. So critics from mostly his home country in England uh, were perplexed as to why a man of fighting age was not serving in the military. And so he received mostly negative criticism from England as to why he was not serving for the British military. Fun fact: Chaplin was 5'5", and so he may have been too short, and he had his own reasons for not serving. And it's not quite clear why he didn't serve, but ultimately he made so many movies, and uh, he would have been very distracting, I think, for troops if he had served on the actual war front. So because he was like responding to English criticism as well as like, well, I live here now. I am like in a way a U.S. citizen because I make money here. I live here. I have friends here, etc. My life is here now. I ought to give back. So that's why he tended to do so.
It's quite nice to hear that he was able to be able to make that decision in his head that, actually I'm here, I need to give back to these people who are who are giving to me. And it's very interesting to hear that dynamic as well. A lot of the UK curriculum makes sure that students hear about World War One, hear about World War Two, and part of that is hearing about the way that conscientious objectors or people who didn't enlist in the beginning were treated. And it's interesting to see how that's even extending to someone who's as famous as Charlie Chaplin.
Yeah, and I think he may have been presented a white feather, which for listeners, that was a sign of cowardice. If you were presented a white feather, usually from a woman, but I can't recall exactly if he was given one or not. But yeah, it was. Especially when he's so famous and wealthy, he was making more money than most people could even dream of, that it would have been just wrong for him to turn his back on the sorts of people he grew up with, like very, very poor people who likely would have been serving for their countries and dying for them.
Yeah, I think, when he's going on these tours and he's interacting with these kind of people and he's trying to get them to sign up for these programs for the United States, there was not a homogenous opinion that America needed to get involved in this war. There was not an homogenous opinion that people should be signing up to pay for these Liberty loans. So did Chaplin encounter any kind of issues apart from, some of these negative press from British? Did he encounter any issues when he was on these tours?
The only issues I can think of, it's half, I'm half joking, is like people wanted to throw pies at him. Which is true. There are at least 2 instances of people like wanting to like participate in slapstick with him and some of the other film stars. But in all seriousness, most people were very welcoming to Chaplin and company, because they had never seen these people before, especially because a lot of people in very small communities likely never left those small communities. So it was having these people from the outside who were just larger than life to them, larger than life to them, coming there. And I suppose the only like disappointments audiences felt was that he never dressed as his character, the tramp. And everyone recognizes the tramp without ever seeing a Chaplin film. He wears a small bowler hat, a little toothbrush mustache, a tight jacket, baggy pants, and large shoes, and has a bamboo cane. Everyone who recognizes film history recognizes this character. And so when he was selling Liberty loans on the tour, he never dressed as the tramp, and he never like did his little walk that he was famous for, the little tramp shuffle. None of that, because this was serious business, and people honestly didn't recognize him because like even I've seen photos of Chaplin for years, and he looks totally different from his character. He's a lot more serious looking. He doesn't have facial hair, and he wears normal fitting clothes. And the tramp just looks like a clown. Like a more gentlemanly clown, like it's all like his character is all about contradictions, but a clown nonetheless. And so people wanted to see the character in person, and he wouldn't do it because his belief, which he may have believed at the time or he thought about years later in his autobiography, was that the tramp only existed on screen. Like that is not something that exists in reality. So I think that was something that people were just not expecting, and they really wanted him to be like his character. But he's a character, he's not a real person.
I think it's really interesting how there's a parallel between the audience of that day and the parallel with the audience of today, where they're making no distinction between the character that Chaplin's playing on screen and the character of the person that he actually is, and trying to engage in those slapstick activities with him when you don't even know the person, but you feel like you know the character. Is very interesting.
Heroes, basically.
So Chaplin's mainly, for want of a better word, serving on the home front, the American home front. And I want to move to the war front now, and look at the second of your studies, which is looking at that entertainment figure, Elsie Janis. Now, this might be a name that some people haven't heard of. I certainly hadn't heard of her. So, who was Elsie, and what did she do?
Elsie Janis, she was a vaudevillian performer in the early 20th century. Her and Chaplin they were born the same year. They were contemporaries. They both started in theater. And she was but she started, they both started in childhood, but she became a household name, I think, earlier than Chaplain did. And she was just very like one of the guys, and she was very popular and very funny, just like triple threat talented. When the war started, Elsie Janis was performing in England at the time, and she remarked how she was ready to go, she was ready to fight, she was ready to perform anything to support the Allied cause. Like already there was people deciding like, oh, we're for the Allies, oh, we're for Germany. Like people were already along those lines, and I think because she had an affinity for England, she was for the Allied cause from the get-go, as a lot of Americans were. But that early on, it was still very much like that's not our war. And so Elsie Janis had already started performing for British troops when the war started. And then when America joined, you couldn't get Elsie Janis to the Western Front fast enough. She was thrilled to be able to perform for more American troops, because she remarked that she was just an American girl. And Janis, I think she performs like somewhere between like a dozen shows a day, or like I think like 600 shows in like 18 months, like something ridiculous on the war front, like in trenches. And these were just short live shows where she's singing and dancing mostly, and telling jokes, but not like a scripted show. This is vaudeville, this is music hall, this is just variety show stuff. And everyone liked her. Everyone just thought she was charismatic and charming and fun. And especially during the war for troops, because they rarely saw women unless they were nurses or truck drivers, ambulance drivers, canteen workers, etc. So for a woman to perform for troops in very dangerous conditions was a marvel.
She certainly seems incredibly inspirational in her tenacity to kind of get to that front and help out those troops. And there's a couple of points there that I really want to unpack about Elsie, because they're really fascinating. I think the first one that I kind of want to touch on before moving on to her perception and gender is that I want to look at the troops. You know, how did her performances affect their morale? Because if anyone's heard those stories of World War One trenches and the World War One in general, it was an incredibly destructive and depressing conflict. So how was she able to affect their morale?
Certainly, yeah. Troops on every side, Allied, Germans, etc., they were dealing with a mixture of terror and boredom. Like it was, if you weren't fighting, you were bored out of your mind. And especially for Allied troops such as the British and the French, those soldiers in the trenches were there for months or years at a time. It wasn't summer camp. It was truly awful and devastating. And to have any glimpse of joy was like, bring it in, definitely want that as much as possible. So like she, no matter what, was a welcoming figure for these soldiers. And I'm speaking from the American perspective, because she mostly performed for American troops, but some English troops and French troops here and there. There is an instance that a few authors describe that soldiers would like swarm her truck when they knew she was arriving. Like she was up and down the Western Front, and would get escorted by people. She would wear just like day clothes, which back then fashion was a lot more formal. So wearing specific clothing in public was a big deal. And in such a casual environment as a trench, if you can call it casual, like a woman wearing day clothes was a big deal because most women were uniformed. And for the troops and their morale, they were thrilled to see an American woman, and an American woman who was only going to make them feel good, who was going to have them sing songs with her, and she was going to like riff on some troops likely. Uh, proposed marriage to her, like, and she would always like turn it into a joke, like like, how can I marry you when I got like a dozen more proposals from yesterday or something along those lines. Like, I'm speculating a little bit, and like troops would even like censor themselves around her because they wanted to come across as gentlemanly as possible because the gender norms were a lot stricter back then. And like, but she just wanted to be one of the guys. So that kind of goes into what I expect you to ask me next. But the morale of the troops went up immensely, uh, even when everyone knew she would perform for troops and they would likely be going off into battle the next day, and she would perform for those same troops that survived in the hospitals if they were wounded.
It must have been a great feeling for her to know that she was providing a light relief in quite a dark period for most of these men. And I do want to build upon that next part where you've alluded to that I'm going to move to, and we've already spoke about it. You know, her gender role then, her role, or how her gender affected her role, and her perception, or the perception of her in the war. She's a woman, as you're saying, in day clothes in a male dominated area. You know, how does that affect, or how does that affect her gender and the perception of her in the war?
Totally, yeah. Was she was still a woman, so she still was like viewed with like kind of a voyeuristic lens. When I was going through like source materials, they don't go that in, like the primary sources don't go that in depth as you want them to be. So they're not going to outright say like she's sexy, even though they were likely thinking it, like, oh, look at those legs or something like that. But yeah, Janis was very keen about her gender. She would even remark how like a little bit insecure she felt when soldiers in drag would perform, like prancing about in dresses or whatnot. And she offered to like loan dresses to them. So she was aware of how soldiers perform gender, how she performed gender, and she never let anyone else dictate her own perception of herself and her gender. And like she would probably be classified as like a tomboy today, because journalists even reference her masculine traits, quote unquote, and she would, because she wasn't afraid of kind of like spreading her legs and like kicking her legs high, or telling kind of a like a racy joke here and there, and and she didn't mind when soldiers like spit and were dirty and all these things that guys were, without the worry of the presence of a woman. Like she wanted that. She wanted to be one of the guys. And I don't know how honest she was when she said that she wanted to fight alongside them. She may have just been saying that, but part of me is like, maybe she did. Maybe she did want to like bring up a rifle, or maybe it was just her uh, trying to show like how pro-war she was, and how much she supported the soldiers, even going so far as saying, "I will fight for them, and I will fight with them," because I think she kind of wanted to.
It sounds absolutely amazing how she was able to navigate that space, which was so, without falling into that kind of I forget what the word is, that stereotype, there we go, of like that locker room kind of attitude and that humor, that she was able to navigate that.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add one more
Yeah,
thing.
of course.
The war itself totally transformed everything about society and culture. So gender norms were also being transformed at this time, which is probably why she was able to get away with like impolite feminine behavior that would not be allowed on the home front at all.
No, no, and it's interesting to see how she was so successful at doing that as well, and those troops, and some of them certainly were in love with her, shown through those proposals that you were talking about. Now, I want to move on to that third figure, who is James Reese Europe, and I think he is an absolutely fascinating character, and I really want to dive into him a little bit more. Could you tell us what he was like, and what made him different from these other performers that we'd already looked at?
Yeah, James Reese Europe, or Jim Europe, as he was known amongst friends and family, etc. He was just an amazing figure. He was a musician, started in the early like jazz community in New York, and I think he was from somewhere in the South. I can't recall off the top of my head, but his career began in New York in the late 1890s. And at that time, it was very segregated, as you can imagine. And more often than not, Black musicians were just not hired. And or they were barred from working in the places been hired by. So a lot of contradictions that, of course, are like make zero sense whatsoever. And James Reese Europe was very ambitious, and he started in 1910 the Clef Club Orchestra, which was a community of about 200 Black musicians uh, from Harlem, the New York City area, mostly Harlem. And it would be a place where uh, musicians could have somewhere to make bookings and be contacted, and a place that was central to them. And the Clef Club Orchestra was very popular. They would perform for many white audiences as well as black, and and because of how good they were and how good their music was, they were contacted. Specifically, Jim Europe was contacted by Vernon and Irene Castle, and the Castles were just a very popular dancing couple. They were white, dancing couple during the 1910s. I'm trying to like they were Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers at the time, just very famous and popular, and they wanted Jim Europe to conduct their band for them when they would perform. And so Jim Europe toured with them across the country. They did not care that he was black. They just saw how talented he was and wanted him. He toured with them for a couple of years. And then that's when the he could see on the horizon, like, America's going to join the war any day now. I should train to be an officer. And so he not just wanted to be a very talented, well-known, popular musician, famous musician, he also wanted to support the US. He was patriotic too, even though the US throughout hundreds of years has been very racist to anyone who isn't white. But it's still home to many people, regardless of race. And to him, joining the war effort and actually fighting in the war could showcase how Black people were patriotic too. Black people were brave and were willing to sacrifice for a country that constantly beats them down. And so, in many ways, not only was he a musician and a soldier officer during the war, he was a civil rights activist. And we'll probably talk about it later. Just it's a shame that he's not as well known. Like him and Elsie, Janis are just not as well known as Chaplain, of course, and other figures later on would come about.
He's, I think it's particularly fascinating how he feels so dutiful, feels a duty to protect a country that's not working to protect him particularly well, and he wants to make that, and we're going to talk about that in a bit, but he wants to make that a staple of his identity, which is so interesting considering the attitudes towards African Americans in that time, and even after this time as well. So I want to focus on his war career and his soldiering career now, and he becomes part of the Harlem Hellfighters. So how does this unit come about, and how does it gain its nickname? Because it's a pretty awesome nickname, if I might say.
It is a very awesome nickname. The Harlem Hellfighters started off as the 15th New York National Guard, and then reorganized when America joined the war as the 369th Infantry Unit. So it was always an all-black unit. The U.S. didn't desegregate the military until after World War II. That was President Truman, who did that. But World War One, everything is segregated, and the Harlem Hellfighters were one of the first units to go over to Europe to fight. They were one of the first units to actually have combat, and they fought in many battles and were probably there for one of the longest periods of any U.S. infantry service unit. And they received their nickname. There's a lot of legends as to how they got the Harlem Hellfighter nickname, because it is, pardon my language, badass. And some say Germany named them that because they were just like, nobody wanted to fight them. It was like they were just so incredibly like fierce, and like you wouldn't want to mess with them. Just notorious for their battlefield bravery and just not letting up. And the likely scenario that I believe has credibility is that the Harlem Hellfighters were bestowed that nickname by American newspapers spreading propaganda at the time. And I don't know why they named them that necessarily. And because it was also like, I think it was because like even Black people are fighting in this war and showing just how worth it is to defend American democracy. Like it's not just white; everyone is involved in this war effort. And the Harlem Hellfighters wasn't just an all-black unit. There was also many service members from Puerto Rico that fought in the Harlem Hellfighters that were specifically recruited for the band that Jim Europe conducted.
It's really cool to see how they were able to come across that nickname either through people being terribly afraid of coming across them in combat, or even that for the split second that the American media has decided to support African Americans when it's beneficial, they come up with an awesome nickname for him. So you mentioned a really cool point in that, is that that unit's band, and Europe plays a role in that. So how does Europe combine his identity as a musician, an entertainer, and this new facet of it, of being a soldier, and how does that affect the US war effort? Because he must have had an awful lot going on trying to be these three things in quite a hard space.
Definitely. Like in the memoirs of Jim Europe, despite the title, it's not written by him because of his early death. It was written by Noble Sissel, who was a member of the band in the Harlem Hellfighters. And in that memoir, Noble Sissel describes during training how he as a Noble Sissel was a victim of racial aggression by a white a member of the military. And they were at a hotel somewhere, uh, and Jim Europe saunters inside, very calm and collected, uh, alleviates the tension and the aggression, and the weird fighting amongst Americans stops. Uh, and that was Jim Europe. He was not an aggressive man. He was uh, looked up to so much by his fellow soldiers, by fellow musicians, family, like anyone who saw him were just in awe of him. And when the war started, he was contacted by Colonel Hayward, I believe his name is, to start a band to help morale on the war front. And initially, Jim Europe was apprehensive about it, just like, I am wanting to actually fight. Like, that's my focus right now. And Noble Sissel claims that he was the one to convince Europe to do both. Like, why not both? You can do it. And Jim Europe, like the gears start turning. It's like, actually, this could be good in many ways. Not only can I showcase Black patriotism through fighting, but I can also show how beneficial Black culture is to the wider American landscape and music at large. And that's what he did. The Harlem Hellfighters band, conducted by Jim Europe, is credited for bringing jazz music to the European continent. Which is phenomenal. And I can't recommend their music enough. It's just so good and fun. So he saw a lot of ways he could benefit both himself, not both, he could benefit himself, his country, and Black people at large, and black being what being Black is. So he's just a tremendous figure and doesn't give the credit he is due.
It's so, and I've used these words so many times in this podcast, but it is so fascinating and cool how he was able to combine them, but also be such an inspirational figure and an instrumental figure in bringing jazz and exporting Black culture to a separate continent. When and that culture is and that music is now so well appreciated across Europe, that he's got a lot to be thanked for, and it's a very interesting character to learn about as well.
Definitely. And I mentioned that he had an early death. Anyone who is listening has to listen to the podcast to find out why. It's a pretty major part of the story.
I don't want to steal away from that story of the death. So if you guys want to listen to it, head to Sarah's podcast and look at her project. But I've got this final fun question for you, Sarah. Now, I've found that you are a fan of early to mid 20th century films. So which is your favorite and why?
I knew this question was coming, and it's so hard to give an answer because I love so many films. I love Chaplain films. I love Shirley Temple films. I love Pre-Code. There's just so many. But the first one that came to my mind is a 1950 film called Harvey, starring James Stewart and Josephine Hull and a few other ensemble members. It is just a delightful movie about a 6'3.5" invisible white rabbit. It's just a feel-good movie, so charming, so delightful, and just brings a smile to anybody's face. So highly recommend Harvey to anyone who hasn't seen or heard of it.
I think that's a good answer. I'll have to go away and watch that one myself, but it sounds like a really nice weekend, relaxing film to kind of pick you up before the week starts.
Big time.
So obviously people are going to want to find out what happens to James Reese Europe. They're going to want to listen to this. This is only a snippet of the World War I entertainment industry and Charlie Chaplain and Elsie, Janis. So where can people go away, listen to your podcast and find you and your other projects online?
Sure. So people can find me at sarahbiegelsen.com. That's Sarah with an H, B as in boy, Ieggelsen as in Nancy.com. I'm used to spelling my name all the time. Sarahbiegelsen.com. There's a link to the podcast website uh, on my website, professional website. It's too much of a mouthful to give that domain out. So just go to my professional website. It's linked there. And when you get to the podcast website, you can learn about each of the figures. There's photographs, links to sources, as well as lists for where I found the music that's featured in the podcast, as well as films I mention, and any other entertainers who participated in war effort work, whether they were producing specific productions or songs that were about the war, or were actually fighting in the war. Like Buster Keaton fought in the war, one of Chaplin's rivals, quote unquote, and lots of other figures. George M. Cohan wrote Over There and You're a Grand Old Flag. And a bunch of other songs. So, that website is linked onto my professional website, and my podcast is also on YouTube, Acast, Spotify, Apple Music, and Audible, I believe, called Showman's Land.
And I must say, it's a great podcast, and I learned so much from it. And the website as well is a great accompanying resource to it as well. So I really recommend that everyone goes away and has a look and listen to them. So thank you very much for coming on, Sarah. I really appreciate your time and enjoyed talking to you.
Me. Yeah, that's thank you so much.
And if you guys are listening and you want to support everything that I do here at History of Jackson, make sure to subscribe to History of Jackson Plus on Apple Podcasts. And I will see you all next week for our next episode.